It's a common trope to see medieval or pseudo-medieval fantasy settings swarming with criminal activity. The depictions vary along multiple dimensions. One spectrum is the morality of these criminal actors. For instance, they can be forces for good, as with the mythology of Robin Hood and his merry men, or forces for bad, as with the ruthless, predatory bandits of The Witcher 3. Another spectrum is the level of organization of these criminals. Sometimes they can be aimless, independent thugs, as with the generic starter bad guys encountered in many RPGs, or they can be goal-driven institutions with ranks and recruiters, as with the Thieves Guilds and Assassins Guilds of the Elder Scrolls series. These types of medieval criminals are amazing concepts to play with, but how much of it is actually based in history? Let's find out.
This video was sponsored by Surfshark VPN. They've got your back when it comes to the dangers of the internet like surveillance, data mining, theft, and locked content. In addition to top-of-the-line industry offerings, Surfshark VPN's awesome features also include multi-hop, which lets you connect using 2 different servers for increased security, whitelister, which allows apps or sites of your choosing to bypass the VPN for things like banking, clean web, which blocks malware, trackers, phishing, and ads, kill switch, which protects against accidental exposure if the server connection gets interrupted, and no borders mode, which maximizes your access in the most restrictive of regions. In addition, Surfshark VPN has very generous terms of use, with unlimited devices, 24/7 customer support, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Try it today by clicking the link in the description below and using the promo code INVICTA to get 83% off, plus 3 extra months for free.
The topic of crime in the medieval era can be a bit of a fuzzy subject. One reason for this is the limited nature of our ancient sources. Sure, we have a lot of material to sift through with which to attempt an analysis, but it's very hard to come up with any statistics on things like murder rates with much confidence. That being said, it does appear that crime and violence in the medieval world was much more of a presence in the daily life of people than it is today. However, we should not go to the extreme stereotype of the past as being some hyper-violent barbaric time. After all, the medieval era covers a vast geographic and temporal domain with many different experiences to be had. Another important reason why discussing crime can be a fuzzy subject is due to the blurred lines of the law itself. Medieval law was complex, with numerous layers of power overlapping and sometimes conflicting. In the absence of a universal code of laws that governed everyone, the church, a monarch, a local landowner, a municipality like a town or city, guilds, and even common people would all try to exert what they believed to be their authority and privileges. One person's right could just as easily be another's crime. With this understanding in mind, let's now address one of the most common forms of criminals in the medieval world, the bandit. The presence of bandits is widely attested to by our sources, especially those of the early medieval period. Records are replete with references to the dangers of roads, forests, and the wildlands. Such fears stem from the highly communal nature of medieval Europe, which had a tendency to fear those who lived apart from and in opposition to their local societal nucleus. But these fears often had a rational grounding. A perfect example of this comes from 16th century Germany, where stories abounded of notorious murderer bandits preying upon the land. One such tale spoke of an infamous villain by the name of Crispin Gnippertinga. It was claimed that he occupied an elaborate cave system overlooking local roads and would routinely descend upon unsuspecting victims alone or with some accomplices. Adding up all the reports, estimates for his death toll reached nearly 1,000 lives, and by many accounts he is regarded as an ancient serial killer. Finally, his decade-long reign of terror came to an end when one of the women he had kidnapped and enslaved managed to escape and lead authorities back to Gnippertinga's lair. For his horrific crimes, the bandit was sentenced to death by the breaking wheel. True or not, the story captures the populace's fears when it came to bandits and the severe punishment that would be meted out to such outlaws. In many places, such men were treated similarly to the wolves who preyed on their herds. Bounties might be placed on the head of a bandit, while legal principles like wolfsteed allowed them to be hunted and killed as animals. But just who were these feared and hated bandits? Well, one category consisted of criminals of opportunity, who robbed, kidnapped, or attacked others as a means of making ends meet. Another category consisted of career bandits, who were capable of carrying out more organized and sophisticated activities like racketeering or heists. But perhaps the largest category of bandits were those with military ties. This should come as no surprise, since much of medieval warfare was based on large-scale looting. Plundering the land was simply standard procedure for most campaigns and represented a significant source of income for the troops. When a war ended and the field army began to dissolve, the men were not so quick to demobilize while there were still fortunes to be made. This sentiment could be reinforced by a lack of pay, an unwillingness to return to ordinary society, or a habituation to the activities of military raiding. Thus, ex-soldiers often ended up forming into small groups to continue their depredations both abroad and at home. For instance, the cyclic mobilization and demobilization of the 100 Years' War produced many soldier bandits during the downtime between official campaigns. In particular, the prevalence of poorer English archers turning bandit helped popularize and shape the legend of Robin Hood we know of today. But Robin was not the only famous medieval criminal hood. In medieval Flanders, the cities of Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres had militia forces known as the White, Red, or Blue Hoods respectively. These groups quickly turned to violence directed at other towns, or even rival factions in their own native cities, and became little more than a faction of armed criminals. Authorities often had to step in and curb the activities of these bandits. However, sometimes they might co-opt them for their own purposes, pardoning criminals in exchange for military service. Other times, the authorities simply joined in on the action, engaging in theft or brigandage of their own. This ran the gauntlet from extortion at the tip of a sword to actual violence. For instance, some noble could easily set up tolls at bridges and choke points without the legal authority to do so. This was an extremely common issue in an age of decentralized power, which has given rise to the term robber baron. Now that we've covered the idea of banditry, let's turn to the more specific idea of organized crime. In the medieval era, this would have taken many forms. You would undoubtedly have had your fair share of criminal families, gangs, and mafia-type groups. Their existence is not that controversial, considering we can find such elements throughout human history who always seem to worm their way into the criminal niches of commerce, trade, and politics. But for our purposes, we are more interested in the criminal entities which took on the trappings of structured, guild-like organizations. After all, the medieval world was filled with all manner of guilds, even for beggars, so it stands to reason that perhaps the criminals also had some of their own. Interestingly enough, the mythology of a supposed thieves guild or criminal fraternity stretches back to our medieval sources, who were equally as fascinated by such a concept as we are. Let's start with a few examples before assessing their validity. One of the most famous cases comes from 15th century France with a group operating out of Dijon. It is here that in 1455 the trial of the Coquillard was underway with some shocking allegations. A dozen suspects had been arrested, but refused to reveal any secrets, until finally, the youngest among them broke. Apparently, he revealed to local authorities 60 names associated with the existence of an underground group of criminals and outcasts. They were reported to have formed an organization equivalent in power to the guilds of medieval cities, and had even crowned their own king. The Coquillards had supposedly managed to thrive in the shadows, using a law of silence, and by adopting their own form of criminal slang, the argot. For instance, pickpockets in their ranks were referred to as harvesters, and forced entry into homes was referred to as les soins roulants. Another famous example comes from Spain. Here, the Garduña supposedly got its start as a group waging guerrilla action against the Moors, and expanded as a secret criminal enterprise. Members were supposedly identified by tattoos on their right hand, and were organized into a vast hierarchy. At the top was a Grand Master with foremen who controlled individual cities. Beneath these were various thugs, thieves, and other groups referred to by code names. Sneaks were young children with nimble hands, mermaids were good-looking youths with charisma, and the handsome ones were sword-armed musclemen. Together, the organization collected its own taxes, pulled the strings of government, and carried out all manner of robbery, kidnapping, arson, and murder. Legend even tells of how they got called upon by the Inquisition to do their dirty work. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, we hear of another vast underground group known as the Banu Sasan. All sorts of crimes were pinned on them, ranging from pickpocketing to murder. Some claimed they made a habit of robbing houses under the illumination of a candle placed on the back of a turtle. Others tell of how they were specialist con artists and forgers who made their money as pretend mystics or merchants of fake holy relics. One source even claims that there was a Banu Sasan poet named Al-Ukbar who self-described himself as being a member of a noble house among, quote, the influential and bold ones. So what do we make of all this? Let's start with the first story of the Coquillards. Returning to this case, we find that the gang members which had been detained were mostly charged of basic crimes like petty theft. Additional witnesses who were called in were not able to corroborate many of the sensational allegations that had been previously made, and such a vast organization failed to materialize in the aftermath of the investigation. Well, of course, you might say. It's a secret society, they must have simply faded back into the shadows. Perhaps. However, this line of thinking can be quite dangerous. Sure, it's possible some secret society like that existed, but we should always reserve belief in the absence of evidence. To do the opposite, and to twist a lack of evidence into some confirmation of the original thesis, is at the core of conspiratorial thinking. With that point made, let's turn to our other two examples to see if these yield more concrete results. Unfortunately, neither the claims of the Gardunia nor the Banu Sasan are given much credibility by historians either. They largely seem to have evolved in popular mythology as catch-all labels placed on unrelated criminals who existed across a wide geographic and temporal period. This practice was put to paper by medieval writers, often commissioned by or hailing from the wealthier parts of society, who wished to create conspiracies among their perceived enemies. These literary descriptions often took the form of inversions, whereby the particular conspiracy in question had deliberately mocked some proper social order. We see this a lot with the witch and satanic crazes, with things like the Black Mass, which purport an inversion of the practices found in a traditional Catholic Mass. It seems that later authors picked up on these medieval writings and ran with them, adding their own layers of mythology over the top. The detailed account of the Gardunia hierarchy we shared earlier, for example, dates to a book written in the 1800s called The Mysteries of the Inquisition. Its contents are treated as highly suspect today, but at the time found an avid audience. These readers were part of a new wave of urban mystery literature that saw an explosion of best-selling titles along the same lines, like The Mysteries of Paris and The Mysteries of London. Such tales were understandably fascinating and would continue to echo through pop culture. Fantasy writers from the 1900s seem to have latched onto them as great writing material, with many sword and sorcery stories like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, in particular incorporating powerful Thieves Guild into their settings and narratives. These tropes were in turn absorbed into early versions of role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons. From there, the idea was solidly established as a core element of the medieval fantasy genre, despite having no confirmed historical basis. But at the same time, I don't want to shut down the whole idea as ridiculous. As we discussed, there are many other forms of organized crime in the medieval world, from bandits to robber barons, gangs, and mafias, all of which are just as fascinating as the yet-to-be-proven Thieves Guild. I hope you've enjoyed this deeper look into the history of medieval banditry and organized crime. A huge thanks to the patrons for funding the channel, and to the researchers, writers, and artists who made this video possible. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.